Greetings, bem-vindos, and welcome to the Whatcom Peace Justice Center's 19th annual commemoration of International Day of Peace. This year is just extra special as we're honoring 20 years of peace and justice. My name is Aline Prata. I work as the center's director, and I'm here with our amazing keynote speaker, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, to record a speech that will air for the first time at the Pickford on September 11th, so maybe that's where you're watching it, and then be available again in all of our online platforms, Facebook, YouTube, and the Dope newsletter on September 21st, which is International Day of Peace proper. International Day of Peace is really the main educational and fundraising event of the year for the Peace and Justice Center, which works as a community hub, a peace library, as you can see around me, and a resource center for activists of all ages and backgrounds in Whatcom County. So whether you've known us since the beginning, like from the good old days, or are just plugging into this event for the first time, please make sure to check our website and also send us your contributions through whatcompjc.org/IDP 2022. There's also some amazing deals from local businesses and artists that you can't really miss in our auction, which will close on September 21st. I'm talking to you today from the Coast Salish territory, specifically the ancestral homelands of Lummi Nation and Nooksack tribes. Their territory has been under military occupation since 1850, but despite of this violence at the foundation of Bellingham and Whatcom County, they continue to both resist colonization and provide important leadership as we move towards peace and justice. Now I'd like to call on the writer, historian, activist, and award-winning author who don't require any introductions, but I'll give an introduction anyway, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, to give her keynote speaker. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz grew up in rural Oklahoma, a child of tenant farmers. As a veteran of the 1960s revolution, she has been involved in anti-racist, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist movements, union organizing, and was one of the founders of the women's liberation movement in the late 1960s. Since 1973, she was focused on Native American and ethnic studies and worked with indigenous communities for sovereignty and land rights, and helped build the international indigenous movement. A historian, writer, and professor emeritus in Native American studies at California State University, she is the author of numerous indigenous-related books and articles, including An Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States and Loaded, a disarming history of the Second Amendment. Her most recent book, Not a Nation of Immigrants, Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, and a History of Erasure and Exclusion, urges readers to embrace a more complex and honest history of the United States. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, welcome, and thanks for joining us today.
I'm very happy to be here.
I know that you have a personal connection with Whatcom County, and I hope you get to approach that a little bit in your keynote today too. We're so excited to hear your keynote speech. Thank you so much.
It's an honor for me to be invited to present the keynote address for the 20th anniversary of the birth of Whatcom Peace and Justice. Thanks to Alina Prata for working out this technology and all the paperwork that has to be done so professionally and with such grace. I have known about and admired the commitment to peace and the marches and rallies in Bellingham organized by Whatcom Peace since September 2002, right after 9/11. Thanks to my nephew, Kurt Dunbar, who is one of the original activists and still active. I recall in those dark days of brutal US invasions and occupations of Afghanistan, then Iraq, being so inspired and energized by the Bellingham peace marches and vigils. And Kurt would send me emails and send photos, videos to me about it. I would pass them on, post them on social media. And it continued long after the world and national protests had waned. And you are still at it. I salute you. It's not surprising that 2002 was a time of action, a desperate time for advocating peace, and a very hard time to make that happen. When the machinery of war was revved up to strike revenge following the September 11, 2001 attacks on the New York Twin Towers and the Pentagon. The Afghan people were victims of the useless invasion a few months after 9/11. With teenage US soldiers who did not even speak the language, chasing the phantom terrorist group that carried out the attacks, or what many of us called rearranging the rubble, since Afghanistan was already smashed and embroiled in a 10-year deadly civil war. The destruction, death, and carnage were reported by fired up, ambitious reporters who embedded with the army and behaved as cheerleaders rather than critics. But the US persisted in war against the Afghan people under the guise of destroying terror groups and overthrew the Taliban, occupying the country while making bombing forays around the country. 20 years later, the US withdrew and the Taliban easily took over again. During the first years, the G.W. Bush-Cheney administration had the military round up thousands of Muslim men, incarcerating and torturing them at secret CIA sites throughout the world, and establishing the prison of interrogation and torture at the Guantanamo base. They were not considered prisoners of war, but simply non-existent as humans. So anything could be done to them. At the same time, Bush, Cheney, and Secretary of State Colin Powell conjured lies about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, a country that had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11 or terrorism. It was simply an excuse to invade and occupy the country, finishing off the destruction that the US had started with the 1991 invasion, but finally eliminating Saddam Hussein, the dictator. In eliminating Iraqi generals and other officials and soldiers who were of the Sunni Muslim faith, which was in power, it replaced them with Shia Muslims who had to be trained. The angry Sunni soldiers soon emerged as a battle-ready terrorist entity, along with ISIS, spreading the war to neighboring countries. Both wars persisted through the second Bush-Cheney presidency and 2 terms under Obama and 1 with the mad Trump. Called the Forever Wars, peace movements got demoralized, being ineffective. President George W. Bush called our peace organizations focus groups as the media turned its cameras to other matters. While young combat veterans returned suffering PTSD, many of them formed renewed veterans anti-war groups like Iraq Vets Against the War, regenerating demands for peace Other battle-scarred and angry veterans turned to the right and joined or formed armed militias. Not a single official from the Bush-Cheney administration was charged with war crimes, nor was any soldier punished for war crimes. The Clinton administration was in the forefront of establishing the International Criminal Court, but the United States did not join it, nor was there any substantial mass movement in the United States for the unindicted war criminals to be brought to justice. The United States claims to be the guardian of law, but it's actually the main breaker of laws internationally. This has brought us to the present, embroiled in a preventable proxy war, with nuclear war a real possibility and climate collapse a certainty, with a critical mass of disaffected and confused people who make up a kind of death cult intent on tearing down government, except for the military, to destroy any part of it that benefits the health, education, and welfare of ordinary people, led by Trump and libertarian billionaires. War seems to be the only response when the United States is met with crisis. Except the short-lived Gulf War in 1991, none of the endless wars since the end of World War II have been popular, many not even known about, such as in Colombia, the Philippines, Somalia, counterinsurgents. The present administration, and despite hardened Democratic Republic division, a bipartisan Congress sees the Russian Federation as something to crush in order to move on to destroy or control China and the Pacific. The US always has to have an enemy, replaying the savage wars, even if they have to create one, which is often the case. What is the peace movement weakened by all of this and lack of any real substantial progress? What are we to do? I don't have the answer, although I think about it a lot. But I do know one thing, that no effective and continuous mass peace movement can develop without coming to grips with inherent US militarism. Otherwise, we are fighting without a strategy, one war after another. I am a historian and am well aware that few historians have come adequately to analyze US militarism and military history. And most people in the United States and even the world who are baffled by US endless wars don't have a clue as to why. Like other activist groups and movements in the US, the anti-war and peace groups also have not confronted the reality of entrenched US militarism, the roots of it, because it takes an understanding of the endless wars that created the US as a state and why they continue, and the pronounced intention of the founders and settlers to take the continent. With the civil rights movement and the 60s cultural movements, profound changes were wrought in the United States so that the majority of people came to reject anti-Black racism and bigotry, to support women's rights to choose, to support Native American cultural sovereignty and struggles against environmental destruction. LGBTQ civil rights, including marriage, welcoming immigrants and refugees. Having grown up in the 40s and 50s, I know what a powerful difference these movements made, of which I was a participant in the 60s and after. However, researching, writing, and speaking on US militarism widely since 9/11 and the Forever Wars, mostly directed to those in the majority who oppose invasions and wars, I find that there is little knowledge and understanding of the structural nature of US militarism. It is not easy to come by. I did my undergraduate and graduate work in history with a specialization in the history of capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism. I studied the rise with the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire that set out to conquer the world in 1492. I studied US imperialism in Latin America. Then I wrote my dissertation on the history of land tenure and colonization of New Mexico. This was 1974, just when ethnic studies was developing in universities. It was also a year after the Lakota Wounded Knee occupation by militant American Indian movement, which ended in the arrest and prosecution of hundreds of Lakota people and other Native and non-Native allies. I was asked by the defense committee of those arrested to serve as an expert witness. I found in a hearing for dismissal in Lincoln, Nebraska, which was a 2-week hearing in 1974, I found that the ordinary tribal individuals, hundreds of them, camped out by the river in Lincoln, the Missouri River, and talked to us all every night, us expert witnesses, anyone that was interested in listening. Some of them had no more than an 8th grade education, but knew more about US history, authentic US history, than I did, or any history professor I ever had access to, or their writings. I never took a single course that even mentioned Native Americans. Today, nearly 5 decades later, there are thousands of Native American scholars teaching at every level, mentoring more Native scholars, researching and writing, following the cues of their oral histories to document the history of this continent, nailing the history of the United States. I was fortunate to have had this gift of oral history in the 1970s. It's not easily available to everyone. I tried to express my gratitude in writing an Indigenous people's history of the United States, what one Native friend calls one-stop shopping, for gaining an overview of US history. What I learned during doing research and documentation, following up on Native oral history, I learned is that the violence of settler colonialism lies at the heart of US militarism, which stems from the use of what military historians call savage war. Savage war, also called petite guerre or little wars, in military annals, and Anglo-Americans' first way of war, as it's called by military historian John Grenier, dates to the British colonial period from 1607 to 1776, and is described as a combination of unlimited war and irregular war, and a military tradition that accepted, legitimized, and encouraged attacks upon the destruction of non-combatants, village people, farmers, villages, burning their crops, burning their homes and granaries and all their agricultural resources in shockingly violent campaigns to achieve their goals of taking the land. When compared to other Western powers that carried out colonial conquests in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and South America, the United States was not exceptional in the sheer amount of violence it imposed to achieve sovereignty over the territories it appropriated. British settler colonialism in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand were equally genocidal and violent as in the United States. Extreme violence, particularly against unarmed families and communities, was an inherent aspect of European colonialism, always with genocidal possibilities and often with genocidal results. What distinguishes the United States experience is its rise to world military dominance and the popular narratives attached to the colonial violence and its political uses, even today. A kind of innocence characterizes the erasure of continued settler colonialism. Romanticizing settler sovereignty is a way of erasing colonialism and indigenous nations, and is a tendency as much on the left or liberal spectrum as the right or conservative. John F. Kennedy thrilled young generation, including me at the time. I was 21, when he ushered in a new liberal era with his romantic rhetoric about U.S. colonialism. In accepting his nomination at the 1960 Democratic presidential, as the Democratic presidential candidate, at the edge of the Pacific in Los Angeles, he said, "I stand tonight facing west on what was once the last frontier. From the lands that stretch 3,000 miles behind me to the east, the pioneers of old gave up their safety, their comfort, and sometimes their lives to build a new world here in the West. We stand today on the edge of a new frontier." Echoing Kennedy, nearly stealing his words, Barack Obama, in an attempt to revive frayed liberalism in the 2009 presidential inaugural address, also romanticized colonialism, even including enslaved Africans as settlers. He intoned, "In reaffirming the greatness of our nation, we understand that greatness is never a given. It must be earned. Our journey has never been one of shortcuts or settling for less. It has been the risk takers, the doers, the makers of things. For us, they packed up their few worldly possessions and traveled across oceans in search of a new life. For us, they toiled in sweatshops and settled the West, endured the lash of the whip," of course that was slaves, "and plowed the hard earth. For us, they fought and died in places like Concord and Gettysburg, Normandy, and Quezon," especially using Quezon, which is a genocidal attack on a Vietnamese city, I found most offensive. "The enemy is savage, endures as a justification for U.S. military interventions of other savages. President George W. Bush's Justice Department employed a precedent from the 19th century called so-called Indian Wars to legitimize military actions and torture in its war of terror. An arc can be drawn from that long ago formative time to the 2011 SEAL Special Forces Operation Neptune Spear to kill Osama bin Laden. Once bin Laden was confirmed dead, one of the commanders reported to the gathered president, vice president, and cabinet, quote, Geronimo, EKIA, is dead. EKIA is the code for enemy killed in action. So the great Geronimo, a holy man who, with his family and a few others, escaped from a reservation prison in Arizona to be free, were then chased for 30 years all over the Southwest and Mexico without success. They finally agreed to turn themselves in if they could be considered prisoners of war and not be hung because of that. And they were, and of course they all died in prison. Settler colonialism, and by the way, all over the world, third world people, national liberation movements, and of course all Native Americans, consider Geronimo a great hero, one of the greatest. So the insult is just mammoth to make Geronimo a 21st century terrorist. Settler colonialism is in the present, not a relic of the past, but a historical condition regenerated at particular moments of conflict. A deep psychosis inherent in U.S. settler colonialism is revealed in settler self-indigenization as discoverers, not intruders. The phenomena is not the same as the practice of playing Indians, which historian Phil Deloria brilliantly dissected. From the Boston Tea Party Indians to hobbyists dressing up like Indians to new age wannabe Indians. Settler self-indigenization genealogy can be traced to the period of the mid-1820s to 1840s, during the forced relocation of all of the agricultural Native people from east of the Mississippi to Indian Territory. What historians call the age of Jacksonian democracy, marked by, among other phenomena, the blossoming of U.S. American literature. The giants of the era are well known to every U.S. high schooler who has had to suffer through American lit classes: Thoreau, Emerson, Whitman, Longfellow, Hawthorne. Among them was James Fenimore Cooper, who was born in 1789 and died in 1851, who conjured the United States origin story in his Leatherstocking Tales, made up of 5 novels featuring the hero Natty Bumppo, also called variously, depending on his age, Leatherstocking, Pathfinder, Deerslayer, Hawkeye. Together, the novels narrate the mythical forging of the new country from the 1754-63 French and Indian War to independence, to the settlement of the plains by migrants traveling by wagon train from Kentucky. At the end of the saga, Bumppo dies a very old man on the edge of the Rocky Mountains as he gazes east. But it is The Last of the Mohegans, subtitled A Narrative of 1757, that relates the self-indigenization myth that has endured. The Last of the Mohegans was a best-selling book throughout the 19th century and has been in print continuously since, along with a half dozen Hollywood movies by that name. The first in 1911, plus several television series made in US, Canada, and Britain. The most recent Hollywood production was a blockbuster made by Michael Mann in 1992, which was the Columbian 500-year anniversary of Columbus' arrival in 1492. It starred Daniel Day-Lewis, who received the Academy Award, and unfortunately, one of the AIM leaders, Russell Means, as the last Indian. So this is when the old man, the old Indian who was dying, presented to Hawkeye the white adopted son, the whole continent, because the native people have died off. Which was, of course, not true. They're simply incarcerated. From the first settlement in Jamestown, appropriating land from its stewards became a racialized war, civilization against savagery, and thereby was inherently genocidal. In the words of historian Richard Slotkin, savage war was distinguished from civilized warfare in its lack of limitations on the extent of violence and of laws for its application. The doctrine of savage war implied that the enemy was not human, therefore anything could be done to him. Depended on the belief that certain races are inherently disposed to cruel and atrocious violence. Similar assumptions has often operated in the wars of Christian or crusading states against the Muslims in Europe and the Holy Land, in medieval times, with crusades into the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, and massacres had often accompanied such wars. We could add the revival of Muslim targeting 1980 to 2022 and counting US demonization and wars against Muslims. Military historian John Grenier, I mentioned before, in his book, The First Way of War, 1607 to 1814, offers an indispensable analysis of the white colonists' savage warfare against the indigenous peoples of North America. This way of war, largely devised and enacted by settlers in order to displace the native and take their land, formed the basis of the founding ideology and colonialist military strategy of the independent United States. And this approach to war continued after the conquest of North America was complete, moving on to invade and occupy the Philippines and other Pacific islands, Central America, the Caribbean, and it's still being practiced almost as a reflex in the 21st century, with a current annual military budget of nearly $8 trillion. Grenier explains that he began his study after 9/11 in the wake of U.S. reversion to irregular warfare, savage warfare in Afghanistan. Then in Iraq, his goal to trace the historical roots of the U.S. use of unlimited war as an attempt to destroy the collective will of the designated enemy and their capacity to resist, employing any means possible, but mainly by attacking civilians and their support systems, such as their food supply. Today called special operations or low-intensity conflict, that kind of warfare was first used against indigenous communities by colonial militias in Ireland by the British invasion occupation of Ireland and a century later in the first British colonies of Virginia and Massachusetts, and became endemic to U.S. existence, expansion, militarism. These irregular forces made up of landed settlers sought to disrupt every aspect of resistance, as well as to obtain intelligence through scouting and taking mostly civilians as prisoners and killing them. They did so by destroying indigenous villages and fields and intimidating and slaughtering unarmed women, children, and elders, scalping, mutilating corpses, poking the eyes out, leaving the bodies for people to walk by and be horrified, seeing their relatives in that condition. These voluntary fighting crews were called rangers in the colonial period, and later in the United States called militias. They are a key feature in the U.S. Constitution and the Second Amendment. Although the U.S. carried out savage counterinsurgency operations in their military invasions and occupations of the Philippines, Hawaii, Haiti, Nicaragua, and other sites in the first decades of the 20th century, they formally reverted to counterinsurgency war during the Korean War, creating the special forces called the U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Division. A decade later, the Kennedy administration created the Green Berets, followed by other named special forces, SEALs, and so forth, in every branch. But these were names for the kind of unconventional warfare that the U.S. had already practiced before and since its founding and as a nation state. That is how the European settlers replaced flourishing agricultural and herding civilizations in the part of North America that the U.S. claimed. The United States often trains, funds, and uses proxies as their contra-war in Nicaragua in the 1980s, to which I was an eyewitness, reporting to the United Nations Human Rights Commission. The present war in Ukraine fits that category. Many historians who acknowledge the exceptional one-sided colonial violence attribute it to racism. However, rather than racism leading to violence, the reverse occurred. The out-of-control momentum of extreme violence, of unlimited warfare, fueled racial hatred, just as the violent enslavement of Africans created racism, rather than racism creating slavery. Just think about the intergenerational effect of successive generations of settlers, both soldiers and civilians, made the killing of Indian women, men, children a defining element of their first military tradition that gave birth to the United States, and thereby part of a shared U.S. identity. They made the savage war a key to being a white American, so their generations of Indian haters, men like Andrew Jackson, turned the Indian Wars into race wars. Neoliberal military analyst Robert Kaplan, with great glee, summarizes the genealogy of the U.S. military today, writing, whereas the average American at the dawn of the new millennium found patriotic inspiration in the legacies of the Civil War and World War II, when the evils of slavery and fascism were confronted and vanquished. For many commissioned and non-commissioned officers, the United States Army defining moment was fighting the Indians. And they still call enemy territory Indian country. The Marine Corps was founded in 1775, a year after the 13 colonies formed the Continental Congress and Army, a year before the Declaration of Independence, 13 years before the U.S. Constitution was ratified, forming the United States. and 23 years before the U.S. Navy was founded. In 1776, the Marines made their first landing, capturing an island in the Bahamas from the British, what in Marine Corps history is called Fort Nassau. In action throughout the Revolutionary War, the Marine Corps was reorganized in 1794 as an autonomous branch of the U.S. Navy. The character of a Marine is that of the colonial ranger created for counterinsurgency outside U.S. secured territory. The opening lyric of the eternal official hymn of the U.S. Marine Corps, composed and adopted in 1847, a year into the war against Mexico and during the occupation of Mexico City. The anthem is, as everyone knows from many war movies of Marine landings, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Montezuma, of course, refers to the war against Mexico and the Marine role. But most people who know the lyrics well do not seem to be very curious about Tripoli. Tripoli harkens back a half century from the Mexican War to the so-called Barbary Wars of 1801 to 1815, when the Marines were dispatched to North Africa in warships by President Thomas Jefferson to invade the Berber nation. Continuing this aggression, shelling the city, taking captives, and marauding for nearly 4 years, ending with the 1805 Battle of Derna. It was there they earned the nickname Leathernecks for the high collars they wore as defense against the Berber saber cuts. The Berbers had no firepower as the Americans did with their cannons. This was the first Barbary War, the ostensible goal of which was to persuade the ruler of the city-state of Tripoli to release U.S. sailors it held hostage and to end what the United States called pirate attacks on the U.S. merchant ships. Actually, the Berbers were simply demanding that their sovereignty over their territorial waters be respected and payment be made for passage. The Berbers did not give up their demands, and the Marines were withdrawn. Returning a decade later, 1815 to 1816, for the Second Barbary War, which ended when Pasha Yusuf Karamanli, the ruler of Tripoli, agreed no longer to exact fees from the United States ships entering territorial waters. This was the first military victory of the U.S. gunboat diplomacy, as it came to be called nearly a century later, when historians mark the beginning of U.S. overseas imperialism. But the Marines and military historians know better. It was from the very beginning. The U.S. had warships on almost every coast in the world, except Europe, every coast of non-European peoples, warships that from time to time simply let off volleys of cannons and attacked or not. So the Marine Corps' next large engagement was the Second Seminole War, one of the three that raged from 1816 to 1858 in the Florida Peninsula. At that time, when it began, it was controlled by Spain. It had been not really settled, but controlled by Spain with some forts there. The U.S. Andrew Jackson simply annexed it, and Spain didn't respond. But this is the longest war in U.S. history that hardly anyone is in any history book at any level, and very few people know about. They might have heard of the Seminoles, ball team or something, but or Seminoles in the Everglades, but they don't know about this longest war in U.S. history. mainly fought by the Marines. The Second Seminole War, the one that took place during the Jackson administration, has been identified with the extraordinary leader of the Seminole resistance, Osceola. It was an all-out war with Army, Navy, and Marine Corps involved. Although they succeeded in killing Osceola, they lost the war, as the Seminoles would not hand over the Africans who had escaped their slavers and were protected by the Seminoles, which is what the United States demanded of them. The military did succeed in deporting captives, mostly women and children and old men, to Indian Territory. But the armed forces returned to try again in 1855, waging the Third Seminole War, but after 4 years of siege, lost again. Soon after, the Civil War and the abolition of slavery made further war against the Seminoles in Florida unnecessary. Of course, the Marine Corps is associated with the Halls of Montezuma lyrics from their trademark hymn composed while they occupied Mexico City in 1847. While the U.S. Army invaded and occupied what is now California, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, the Marines and Texas, the Marines invaded by sea and occupied Veracruz using counterinsurgency tactics in their march to Mexico City, burning fields and villages, murdering and torturing civilian resistors. They occupied Mexico City along with Army divisions until the Mexican government, under brutal occupation, in other words, a gun to the head of the president and the general, they signed a dubious treaty transferring the northern half of Mexico to the United States. It is an illegal border because it was, the treaty was created under duress. In Marine Corps annals, the 1847 Battle of Chapultepec is Legion, a battle in which a handful of teenage Mexican cadets, the Chapultepec Castle was used as a military training school. With few weapons and little ammunition, they held off the Marines, killing most of them over 2 days of endless fighting in the castle until the cadets themselves were all dead. And the remaining Marines raised the U.S. flag and wrote their hymn, tracing their genealogy to the invasion and occupation of Tripoli. In a 2017 portrait of President Donald Trump's Secretary of Defense, retired Marine Corps General James Mad Dog Mattis, journalist Dexter Filkins wrote that the Marines see themselves as a kind of warrior caste with toughness under fire and savagery in battle. Being much smaller than the Army, its budgets are skimpier and the equipment sometimes antiquated, while its fighters are often pitched into terrible conditions. But the Marines take their scant resources as a source of pride. Where the Army scatters recruits across a vast institution that includes accountants, mechanics who have little contact with the harsher realities of military work, every Marine is trained as a rifleman, a combatant. Later in the century, Marine actions, particularly the infamous war in the Philippines and others up to the present, are well known, but they themselves take pride in their origins and behavior, which most U.S. Americans, including leftists, know little or nothing about. If they did, they would have to reconsider the overlooked violence in the nation's founding narrative. So the United States is a militarized culture. We see it all around us and in the media. But as military historian John Gradier notes, the cultural aspects of militarization are not new. They have deep historical roots reaching into the nation's settler past and continuing through unrelenting wars of conquest and ethnic cleansing over 3 centuries, and continuing. Grenier writes, beyond its sheer military utility, Americans also found a use for the first way of war in the construction of an American identity. The enduring appeal of the romanticized myth of the settlement, not calling it conquest, of the frontier, either by actual men such as Robert Rogers or Daniel Boone, or fictitious ones like Nathaniel Bumppo, James Philip Fenimore Cooper's recreation, points to what D.H. Lawrence called the myth of the essential white American. The astronomical number of firearms owned by U.S. civilians, with the Second Amendment considered a sacred mandate and almost daily mass shootings, is also intricately related to militaristic culture and white nationalism. The militias referred to in the Second Amendment were intended as a means for white people to eliminate indigenous communities in order to take their land, and for slave patrols to control Black people. We have a mammoth task ahead of us that will require educating and building a massive anti-war peace forces in every nook and corner of this country. We can do it because we must, and I'm sure that Whatcom Peace and Justice will be in the forefront. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. I can't thank you enough for this inspiring keynote. At the end of your book, or at the beginning of your book, The Nomination of Immigrants, you open it with a comment, with a poem from Sherman Alexie, which finishes saying, the United, and I encourage everybody to actually get a copy of the book, get a copy of the poem book as well, and read it all. But the end says, the United States wants us all to forget the crimes it's committed against Indigenous people, against the Indigenous. The United States wants us to forget. The United States wants us to forget. The United States wants us to forget. So I wanted to thank you for helping us remember. That's a really important task. 2 years ago, we had for International Day of Peace another historian who joined us for a keynote with Erin Dixon. Her name is Walida Marisha, and people can access that International Day of Peace video also online on our page. And Walida said something that stuck with me, which I also mentioned to you regarding the project that we're working on right now. She said that, and referring to the history of the Pacific Northwest, particularly anti-Blackness and settler colonialism, that repression breeds resistance, and that they need to be talked about together, right? Like every time that we bring up the history of oppression and repression and violence, we also need to balance it with the history of resistance to make justice to that. And to the people who put so many sacrifices to still be here resisting today. And you know, that's what the center has been trying to do through the Perilous History of White Supremacy book, through our Peace Library, through so many resources that we share with the community, and especially through intergenerationality, which is a key feature of our program and of our demographics. And also, of course, through the timeline of resistance, of peace and justice activism that we're working with right now. So now I really wanted to ask you, like you covered a lot of this history post 9/11 and also like more current history, but I wanted to ask you, what lessons from Indigenous resistance at home and abroad can we actually implement locally in our struggles against the US war machine?
Yeah, resistance is central. And Native Americans is, there's each tribe that is unique, their language, their culture, but in that resistance to colonialism, they also built a pan-Indian movement as a reiteration over time with Crazy Horse, with other leaders, and also, the American Indian movement, and most recently the Red Nation out of Albuquerque. So they really have, in addition to the many cultures, more than 300 languages and cultures and land bases, and they're as different as, French and Norwegians, different nation. But in this overall is a culture of resistance. And then that is taken to the local level of maintaining that resistance. A lot of that has to do, I would say that a great deal of it has to do with storytelling, retelling these stories, which is how I learned this perspective on U.S. history that I was already doing colonialism, imperialism. I didn't have to learn that, but I wasn't really getting to the roots. And I know back in the 60s, we had huge resistance movements at every level. Women, GIs coming back from Vietnam, Native Americans, Wounded Knee, and especially Black power and the whole civil rights movement. But none of us, except I think at times Martin Luther King, really understood, including me, this history, and Native Americans, understood what was at the core of this and makes it keep repeating itself. And so I think that storytelling, to keep telling this history, not in a formal classroom way, but to actually have sessions for peace groups and other groups to have sessions where you repeat the story of the United States. There are actual scripts for it, like in my book and in almost every Native American scholar's book, and in the poetry, Sherman Alexi's poetry, Simon Ortiz's poetry, Joy Harjo, who was just retired from being the poet laureate of the United States. She's Creek from Oklahoma. So many poets, and they're telling this. Simon Ortiz from Sand Creek is one of the best oral lessons, read aloud. So it doesn't mean going and libraries and reading deeply in books. I didn't do that in order to learn this. I already had a lot of knowledge of U.S. history, which most activists do have, absolutely, as far as it goes, but they don't go to the roots. And so it keeps repeating and repeating and repeating. It was so devastating after the Vietnam War and how much we fought that a few years later, they were in Central America, overthrowing the Sandinistas, putting a stop to the liberation movements there. And it just seemed, nothing that we had done had staying power. And then, of course, they invaded Grenada, overthrew the Grenada, and then Panama, and then went to, the Gulf War and these forever wars. So, we lived in that generation. I knew about the Korean War. I was a kid during the Korean War, and there'd been the World War II. But we really thought Vietnam, we had such a powerful movement. And the Vietnamese always said that we had a lot to do with, getting the troops to pull out. We became ungovernable. We closed down every university campus. People went underground, were blowing up military installations and all. And it was really ungovernable. We won, and yet we didn't, because we didn't know what the next step was to understand this is endemic. And so I think it would really liven up all of our groups to devote a great deal of time to this kind of storytelling. And I don't advise anyone to go looking for a Native person to explain everything to them. I would never have done that. I was pulled into being an expert witness and listened, simply listened. But unless you have a useful reason for being there, you can learn it on your own. There's plenty of literature. You don't have to go say, oh, I need a guru Native American person to teach me individually. No, this has to be a mass consciousness. And so I think there's a necessity for that, absolutely urgent necessity, and also supporting Native leadership in trying to deal with climate change. I remember back very early in 1972, Native Americans going to the first UN World Conference on the Environment in Stockholm, Sweden, and speaking there. And it just was amazing to the people there to have Thomas Banyaka, this holy man, Hopi, telling, that the world is going to end. They had their prophecies, and we must make that not happen. And so we must start now. We didn't start then, we didn't. And we barely started now, and it's already with us. So that's a kind of war itself, that military should be transformed and all its resources transferred to fighting climate change and also rescuing people who are drowning, rescuing people off islands that are being swallowed by the ocean. We're going to need, and the US military is actually a transferable force to doing good. We saw that during the pandemic with the National Guard, giving shots and, because they're trained in medicine, the ships, the medical ships and all. We saw it in the tsunami in Indonesia. It was wonderful. The US, it is possible, but that means no more war, only peace, and be leaderships in peace in the world.
Now, you touched on this issue of resources, and I wanted to bring up one more question as we begin to kick off our Q&A. I was already in a row and didn't announce it, but this is our Q&A section. I call dibs on asking the first questions because I can, but the audience will hopefully chime in with their questions to the Pickford in a few minutes. My next question is kind of related to your work to the same book, the Not a Nation of Immigrants, where you mentioned that the first policy, the first immigration federal policy that we have is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, right? Just marking this history of erasure and exclusion through policy and beyond. This year, the center has joined forces with farm worker-led community to community and several other organizations and individuals all across Whatcom County in a campaign that's called Migration Makes Us Stronger. That campaign brought 10,000 butterfly origamis through a community art installation to City Hall, asking the city to put funds towards an immigrant resource center. This campaign connected so many, different struggles, from nuclear remembrance to displacement by militarism and climate change. And I wanted to ask you to talk about the need for our country and for our county, I guess, like our regional communities, to commit to putting resources towards community-led solutions and equity or reparations measures.
Yeah, this is fundamental. I think that the national level is, the last place that should be massively organized. I definitely think, mass demonstrations in Washington, of course, with the protests against the abortion ban. This is needed, but these are particulars. But for this kind of building block by block community, this is really how the right wing came to power, the John Birch Society, which is this right-wing fascist organization that formed to oppose school integration in the 1950s after the Supreme Court decision, they're no longer very important. They still exist, but they set the pattern of how to organize, literally, city by city, town by town, city hall by state, and forget about the national. Actually, they put Barry Goldwater up, but he lost. But next time they put Nixon up, he won. And that, that took off. So by 1975, they were powerful, and they went for the Supreme Court. And they just succeeded in doing that last year. So they had the long view, but they were organizing, especially women. They called it kitchen table organizing, writing handwritten letters, thousands, tens of thousands, to their representatives, taking over school boards, taking over city councils by getting elected. I mean, not a Trump thing of cheating, but organizing, so they didn't always tell what their motives were, but we have to, that's what we have to do. It's very hard work. And you all are doing that there, I know, but it's also an example. And then what we have to do is federate all of these. And we have the gift of the internet, as horrible as it can be, but we do have, when I think back to the 60s, boy, we could have done this, and this with the internet, done it faster. I mean, we did it, and the Vietnamese did, beat the biggest military power in the world. They didn't even have an air force without the internet, even without telephones or anything. So it's not required, but we have it, it's there for us to federate, and not in some boring meetings, droning on and panels and all, but strategizing, actually strategizing, and not worrying about your nonprofit status. If you lose it, to hell with it, the right wing pays no attention. The NRA is a nonprofit. They have a nonprofit status. I mean, you can do almost anything, and people get scared of it, though, because the rich people usually who fund it are nervous, and that's a problem. So we have to break loose of that and really be just courageous, and bold and insistent. I really like that came out immediately after the Supreme Court decision on Roe versus Wade. That anger and passion is what we need to sustain. And it was very well pronounced what it is. People could get to microphone. It wasn't like people were just going nuts, but it was with passion. And that's what we've lacked. And I think young people feel very strayed, that there's hardly any leadership they can look up to, or something already going. In the 60s, all you had to do was step in line in the demonstration, go to that meeting, get involved, and you get massively, you learn as you go, and we don't have that kind of setting now. We have to create it.
Yes. Thank you so much, Rich. I think it's also highlights the importance of community funded resources, right? I think that's the strength of the center. Our strings are not attached to big grants or to the government. Most of 50% of our donations comes from individuals, and our average monthly donation is $30. So really, we're accountable to the people, and I think we need to see way more of that, and way more community surging together for that passion. I am just in awe with your work, could hear you forever. And I'm so excited to savor the next live Q&A that is going to come soon. So I'm just, with that, I'm going to close this section and invite our community to join us live. for our Q&A panel with you the day after Labor Day at the Pickford.
Who wants to go first? Yeah, Josh, come be bold.
Roxanne, I know you've put out a lot of books lately, but I'd like to know what you're working on next.
What I'm working on next, I like to be asked that question because I hope I get some ideas from anyone. I'm doing a book of essays on Christian nationalism. I don't know if everyone is familiar with that kind of new term. It's a white nationalism, but Christian-based, evangelical. And unlike in the past, it's a merger of evangelical right-wing Catholicism and Protestantism.
All right, round number 2. Come on up, friends.
This is a little off topic, but I've been a pacifist since Vietnam, but the Ukrainian war has got me puzzled. I'm not sure how I would react in that environment.
That's really been difficult for me and all everyone I know who works in the anti-war movement. I follow very carefully and trust Code Pink. I'm sure you know about Code Pink. Medea Benjamin. She is the most knowledgeable, informs herself. And it's a mixed reaction. It's, of course, the bottom line is a condemnation of any armed invasion, even if provoked. I mean, which I think there was provocation, but I don't think there was any excuse for it. That it could have been handled diplomatically. So in condemning the Russian invasion or Putin's invasion, I think there's then a question about the United States having some interest in keeping it going, the huge arms sales that are taking place and the huge amount of money added to the already bloated so-called defense budget. So I think there are demonstrations going on all the time that really don't get much publicity at all, but I'd like to see a national rally, maybe in DC and around cities, anti-war, against the war, for the United States to do everything possible. The Ukrainians are going to do whatever the United States tells them to do. And they keep saying, oh, well, it's up to the Ukrainians. No, it's not. It's up to the Europeans, and especially Britain and the United States, to persuade for diplomacy and a ceasefire, at least to begin with.
A little closer.
I am a pacifist, and I don't believe in killing animals either. And as a Christian pacifist, I see that in Genesis, there is a direct translation by the Priest for Equality in 2008. It says we are to be stewards of the world, of the earth. And I'm just wondering how I can pass this message along to help our environment, because I know that the methane kills the greenhouse, produces more greenhouse gas, and each one of us, as a steward of this environment, could be eating vegan whenever we can. One meal of vegan would stop 25 pounds of greenhouse gases, according to the old 1.5 million a year for a vegan to save greenhouse gases calculation that I made. How can I make this? I don't have internet. How can I put this out?
Well, if I understand the question correctly, and you can correct me if I don't, but the relationship between the military and environment, including the effect on animals of all kind. Of course, we know that the U.S. military is the biggest polluter in the world. That doesn't even count, U.S. people polluting, but right here in the United States, the Army bases. I live in San Francisco, and they still have not cleaned up completely. There's radioactivity all over, from Alameda to our Mission Bay basin, and it's not cleaned up anywhere in the world. And of course, there are over 800 bases around the world that are major polluters, and it's hardly ever brought up. It's probably no more than 7 to 10% of pollution worldwide. But it is something, that is vast and is everywhere. And of course, there are also the warships moving around constantly all the time. And with that pollution that those make are far greater than, say, the civilian cruise ships, which make a lot of a mess too. But I don't think it comes anywhere near the warships, the U.S. warships that are on the South China Sea and on every coast of in the world. So there's that. I think there's in the population and among people that the commitment of protection of animals and the environment is very high, the consciousness and I think there's just not really a governmental program or even statewide. We probably a little better and on the West Coast and the Northwest and California, but a lot to be done even there. We're faced with a climate catastrophe. And it's not only people being displaced from their habitat, but all the animals, all living things are. The species are becoming extinct at a very rapid rate, and that's we're in that chain, and that's our destiny. If we don't protect at that level, at the level of the tiny fish in the ocean too, it will get to us. So we have a vested interest, in life, and instead we have a kind of death cult, mainly through military, but also just in the culture itself of not coming to terms with this, and the difficulty of even getting a little bit of environmental protection in, with it balanced off to a new pipeline in West Virginia. It's not looking very good. So we certainly need action, very massive action.
I think we have time for one more question. So I don't know if you need to do rock, paper, scissors. But please come up and let's ask one last question.
My question was, you were involved in the project with Raoul Peck, Exterminate All the Brutes. And I'm really interested about some of the challenges you faced infiltrating the Hollywood kind of propaganda machine.
Yeah, it wasn't really Hollywood, it was HBO, which is located in New York. And does some really good documentaries. And Raoul Peck is a fiercely independent. He's never done a Hollywood movie. His films are all independent and mostly European funded and third world. He's Afro-Asian filmmaker. And so it was quite a pleasure, even though it wasn't in the industry, Hollywood and all that. Of course, it was nominated for in the Academy Awards and in the Emmys, and he won he was a runner-up for the best documentary for the James Baldwin "I'm Not Your Negro," that documentary. So it was wonderful working with him. They're based in Paris, and so we worked mostly online. But he used three wonderful books. Historians, and the other two authors, passed away before the film was finished. I think it was probably 5 or 6 years before he even started. And then he found my book. He said he discovered it. I said, that's like Columbus discovering America. It was there. You didn't discover it. Someone pointed it out to him, my book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States. And he said, well, I have to include the United States because it was just about Africa and the Caribbean, mainly Haiti, Haiti author. And then the Swedish author on African colonialism. So he started all over with a series to work in U.S. colonialism. It never crossed his mind that the U.S. he's a left person, and he dislikes the U.S. militarism. Of course, it's invasions and occupations of Haiti, and constant interference and turning it into, the mess that it's in. But he had no idea. He knew there were Native Americans, but he hadn't thought of it as a colonial situation. My book convinced him, and he was just blown away. And so I got to work with him very closely and help with the script. And I never dealt with scripts before. It's a very different kind of writing. It's very he'd say, take this paragraph and make it into no more than 10 words, for the script. Wow, that was really hard. I could have reduced my book, to very few words. But of course, it has to have the visual, is what tells the story. So, but he read a lot from the book in the series, and so it was 2018 when I went on board, and it came out 3 years later, and I worked on it, a lot during that time, and it was very exciting, but not a Hollywood thing. Never went to LA or anywhere near Hollywood.
All right, Roxanne, this is Alini back. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. And
Thank
I
you.
appreciate everybody that came out here today. MC Sue will close us up in the Pickford, but I just wanted to take a second to thank you and thank everybody for their patience with our technical issues and for celebrating 20 years of peace and justice struggles. Hopefully we'll leave today more inspired to continue to be engaged in our community to transform and make peace and justice a possibility. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone, and congratulations on your 20th anniversary.